Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Defend and Grow Your Marketing Budget in 4 Easy Steps, sponsored by Mutinex. My name is Megan Kane, and I'll be joining you today as the staff representative from the American Marketing Association. Before we start, I wanted to point out the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen, which is where you can ask any questions of the Mutinex team throughout the entirety of the presentation. One of our speakers will be around at the end to help answer those questions. Additionally, you can find the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen where you can interact with the content and socialize with any other attendees. Today's session will be recorded and available for on-demand viewing. It will be available within 24 hours after this webinar, and you will receive a link with access to the content on demand. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce you to our speakers for today. Will Marks and Tracy Wong. Will is the Marketing Science Director at Mutinex, and Tracy is a Marketing Science Partner. Please join us in welcoming Will and Tracy.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks so much for that introduction. It's so great to be here, and thank you for having us. We're going to introduce ourselves a little bit more in a minute alongside Mutinex. But for everyone joining us today, I just wanted to say firstly, hello, and I really hope you find today's session really useful and give you some really great guidance on how to defend and grow your marketing budget. So let's jump in, and I'm going to be handing straight over to Tracy to take us through today's agenda.
Love it. Thanks, Will. Cool. So I think we'll just start off probably with some context setting later. Based on a lot of chatter and things that we've heard from customers of Mutinex on the marketing side for what's going on with marketing budgets, and it's being cut left and right. But why is it also so hard to get more budget when we know that we need it? And then we'll obviously dive into the main topics of what are those 4 easy steps to really defend and grow your marketing budget. So just to quickly touch upon them, we're going to talk about what is that North Star or the right metric that we really should be aiming for when we're talking about marketing. Then talking about a bit of a mindset shift in how do we, talk to the overall business and specifically the C-suite, because that's what we're going to need to do in order to defend and grow that budget. Then we'll switch gears a little bit into this, very dark and mysterious side of brand, which we all know really works, but how do we really unlock the value and start to quantify what brand is doing? And lastly, and most importantly, is to back it up, right? Is to talk about not only just what reporting on all of the value, but how do we think about that from a marketing budget moving forward, and how do we continue to optimize that? So first, before we dive in, Will, maybe you want to give a little bit of an intro into Mutinex and us?
Thanks, Tracy. So who is Mutinex? Well, Mutinex is ultimately a software as a service marketing mix capability solution. There's 3 key parts to what makes up Mutinex ultimately. Firstly, you've got Growth OS. That's what we're calling out at the bottom in blue. Ultimately, this is the self-serve capability to go in and understanding what is driving growth for your business. That's supported by Data OS. Now, Data OS is ultimately a fully fledged data ingestion product, so we can be automating and reducing the friction and the complexity in supplying data. And finally, you have Marketing Science. So that's myself, Tracy, and the rest of our team. We're looking to provide the advanced analytical support to be making sure customers can drive as much value via Growth OS as possible. So on that, let's maybe just jump in a bit more detail into who Tracy and I are and why we feel qualified to talk to you today. Ultimately, in our careers, we've got a fairly well-rounded view across different publishers, agencies, analytical companies, etc., focusing on media and media measurement. For myself, as introduced earlier, I'm the Director of Marketing Science at Mutinex, and I've worked in the past at the likes of Meta, Kantar, Sky, Virgin Media, etc. So most of my career has been spent in the world of analytics. Tracy, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I also have been in the marketing media space for quite some time. Spent many years at Omnicom Media Group, specifically at OMD and Hearts and Science at the media agencies, working on media analytics specifically and investment analytics. Then I ended up transitioning over to what is now Warner Brothers Discovery. So I was working on the HBO Max product for a very long time, doing more general marketing analytics. So covering all of the measurement tools that we have in our toolkit and kind of bringing that to life for marketing. How do we prove that value? Basically the topic that we're here to talk about today. So both Will and I, being on the marketing science team here at Mutinex, we work with our customers, marketing customers, on how to use Growth OS and an MMM to really drive value, right? So what we've been seeing from a lot of our customers is hearing, my budget's being cut, I, can't get more budget, and I don't know how to make it work harder, and what do we do with this? So figured, it's very topical probably for everyone, and wanted to maybe first start to explore what's actually happening in the market. So Will, maybe you want to give some thoughts on, what are you and us hearing about what's going on?
Thanks, Tracy. Yes, I guess everyone's probably tuning in today because of the state of their marketing budgets and the pressures that they're under. In terms of what we're seeing and hearing from our customers, we know that businesses are under pressure from a whole bunch of different angles. So we've got inflation pressures on consumers, and that's flowing through into overall business performance, and therefore what businesses are able to actually be spending. We have the interest rates that are adding additional pressure. It makes it harder to borrow and invest in order to improve product offerings. But ultimately, businesses still have these growth targets. They've still got to be growing in these tough times. And marketing teams still are having to find ways to get more out of every dollar spent. So no matter where we look from different sources, a lot of marketers are saying that their budgets are either decreasing or staying flat, and especially versus their expectations on what they're looking to achieve. So there's certainly a lot of challenges being faced out there at the moment. So if you're facing this, you're definitely not alone. Another key aspect of this is just that growing complexity in that media channel landscape. So many advertisers are being challenged that they must be distributing their media spend across more and more channels if they're hoping to reach the right audiences. So we're seeing the likes of out-of-home becoming increasingly digital, the emergence of SVOD, digital audio is doing exceptionally well at the moment, and the emergence of retail media. So all these advertisers are having to say, how do I try and spread my budget across these additional channels? And do I have to be pulling my budget across some of my traditional channels? And the danger there is that if you start reducing your media budget across those traditional channels, those channels might start to underperform. You might start to go below that threshold required, that lower threshold of investment required to achieve a good efficiency from those channels. Tracy, I know you've also been working alongside some of these new emerging channels and seeing some of the challenges there as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic, right? Like there's new stuff coming up all the time, and the new channels that happened maybe a year or two ago now have become mature. And so that kind of table stakes dollar amount you have to put into those new channels no longer are the same, right? You have to take actually more dollars to actually make an impact in those quote unquote new channels, which are not so new anymore. So when you think about it from like a total budget perspective, not only do you have to spread across channels, but some of the newer channels, you actually have to put more money in order to have the same impact that you did last year. So it's definitely a really hard, like complex media landscape to navigate for sure.
And as soon as you navigate it, I guess everything starts to change underneath you again, and you have to constantly reevaluate how that marketing budget is being spent. So yeah, there's a lot of difficulties in trying to make sure that that's being done as best as possible. But if we all go back to marketing school, we know that reducing marketing budget can come with a significant risk. So from past recessions, there's been research that suggests it can take 3 to 5 years to recover the equity caused by going dark during those periods. And again, if we think about the fundamental theory of it all, it's so important to be maintaining an equivalent share of voice to your share of market. We see time and time again, and the research being done in the space says that if you start to reduce your budget and see a decline in your share of voice, your share of market is likely to follow suit. So as soon as those budgets get put under pressure and you can't be maintaining that, there's definite risks to the business performance. And then there's just the other aspect of, as well as maintaining that market share, how can you try and ensure you're shoring up your your robustness in price sensitivity, making sure that you've got a strong enough brand that you're not having to do discounts in order to be driving and hitting those growth targets. So we know that there's a lot of challenges in the budgeting and marketing, but it's so important to be maintaining enough share of voice and general presence in the market in order to be achieving those growth goals. So that kind of brings us actually to the crux of what we're talking to today. Why is it so hard for marketing teams to be arguing for the budget that they need in order to be achieving those goals? Tracy?
Yeah, it seems like it should be obvious based on just the three things Will talked about, right? Like we have to do more with less or the same, and it's actually much more complex and we have to be on. But why is it difficult? And really it comes down to, a topic near and dear to all of our hearts here, is measurement. And it's, measurement's really, really hard for marketing. Everyone knows this. And so let's take a look at why. I think there are some external headwinds as a first part, which really covers the first two buckets here. So I think we talked a little bit about this complex media landscape. There's many, many channels, meaning we need to understand the actual value of each of those channels. So what is out of home doing versus TV versus all the digital channels? Not only that, but then you get to the more nuanced questions of like, okay, but we actually need to understand the performance of each channel or like the specific audience we're going after. And then there's obvious questions around, do we know that people actually saw the ad? Like, was that impression actually get to a consumer and have an impact? So those are just really scratching the surface of the complex media landscape, but that is also a really big headwind into measurement because there are just so many things, right? And how do we measure those things? The second headwind on an external basis is, a breaking toolkit that you can see in the middle. So what that means, and we all know as marketers, there's so many ways to measure things. There's, brand lift studies. You can go on campaign delivery metrics and MTA, last touch, MMMs, et cetera. And a lot of those solutions, what has historically been used for, wanting to understand from bottoms up, looking at the actual consumer journey, what are the ads people are seeing that lead to conversion? That all relies on privacy, right? And we know that legislation-wise, that has come down real hard. And the ability to actually track across devices, and we have 5, 6 devices a person, and over a long period of time to see what's actually happening is essentially non-existent now. So that makes tools like MTA and last touch really hard to use. The third piece that I have here is probably the most important that we'll start to dive into a little bit more. So it's not really an external factor that's a headwind, but it's something that we need to start thinking about more generally for how do we talk about marketing to the business. So we have tons of metrics from all of those tools that we have. The issue is that us as marketers, we know the value of all of those metrics together. But when we talk to a broader business, it's a little tough because they don't know what an impression means or like what does awareness really mean or viewability, like how does that relate to the business? And so I think this is the first part that we have the ability and control to actually adjust on our end. So I don't want to focus too much on the negative because I feel like the last couple of minutes, Will and I have just been like, it's really hard out there and your budgets are being cut and look at all these issues. So we can probably dive into the main section of it, which talks about these 4 easy steps. So step 1 is really about finding your North Star. And I want to maybe set the context a little bit for how this usually plays out. So it's the end of the quarter. The CMO is now asking you as a marketer to be like, I need to make this report on what's marketing doing because I need to tell them that marketing is doing a good job. Are we hitting our targets? Are we not? Do we need less money? Or sorry, do we need more money? Which is always going to be the ask that we have. So us as marketers, we go into all the tools that we have, all of the reports that we have, and the 10,000 metrics that we collect that we know are all important and nuanced in creating the real story of all that's happening. When you try to get that to a really succinct report, you end up with just this like wall of numbers that you're staring at. And so you're seeing like all of the different channels, all of the different audiences with your reach, your frequency, your clicks, your cost per click, your cost per CPMs, et cetera, all the way until it doesn't fit on the slide. And you're like, okay, this is what I'm going to give to the CMO because it arms them with all of the information that they need. The CMO gets that and they're like, oh, I know this is all important, but this is not at all going to be something I can talk to a CFO or a CEO on. So that's kind of the question that we're trying to it's really important actually what metric we're looking at. So it brings us to this importance of we have all these things, which one do we want to use? So let's take a look at some of them that you can see here. We've rated kind of buckets of them into actual business relevance, because that's the goal here, right? We want to say, bring marketing, what is the value of marketing to the actual business? So if we start on the left, I'll just touch upon each pretty quickly. We have things with low business relevance. So these are more campaign delivery metrics. And unfortunately, these are the metrics that are actually the easiest to get and report on real time. So things like TARPs, reach, impression frequency. You can get that from your digital channels really, really easily. But the question is, is it just as simple as if I increase my impressions, then that's going to lead to more revenue for the business? That's what the CFO and CEO are probably trying to ask of marketing. And the answer is maybe, but it's kind of hard to answer, because how do you know that those impressions actually reached people? How do you know they reached the same people enough times, or did they reach different people? So that's why we've put that at low business relevance, because although they are important to look at as marketers to help optimize our campaign, it's kind of low relevance when it comes to, the C-suite, et cetera. If we move a little bit more to the right, we have proxy metrics. So things like viewability, attention, your video completion rates, et cetera. You start to move a little bit closer into, okay, now I know how many people saw the ad. I know how many people were engaged with it. But you still can't fully make that connection of, okay, as long as I increase my video completion rates, does that lead to more dollars? Maybe, but still not quite sure. So now we're going to move further to the right of brand metrics, which, we know now this becomes something that's a little bit more tangible, where we usually do see this direct correlation of if you increase awareness, consideration, or intent, you actually do increase sales. But it's super hard to quantify because of the collection of that data, right? You don't know what channel's driving it. And, it's hard to put a dollar value to it. You just know that there's this relationship that's happening. So that's why it's high business relevance in that we know it's doing something, but super hard to quantify. The last piece, and you can tell we're probably getting to this North Star now, of the business performance metrics. So sales value, sales volume, leads. These are all of the things that everyone in the business is actually already talking about. So it makes sense, right? That marketing should also talk in the same lingo so that we can make that justification. Now, I say that as if it's like, oh, well, obviously everyone should do that. And if it's easy, then why don't we all do this? The issue is it's actually really hard. And so it leads to the question of well, how do we do this? What are the tools that we have that can actually do this? Because most things are actually campaign delivery metrics. Luckily, we have something that can help. So let's talk about econometrics, which is really fancy. I studied econ in school, so it makes sense to me and probably all of the CFOs out there. But it's the solution of a marketing mix model, right? And this is essentially the bread and butter of what Growth OS is. What it is using an econometric or taking what's happening in the economy as signals with your sales to uncover what are all of the factors that are actually impacting your sales. So we include things, the most important thing, what is all the marketing that you're spending, where, when are you spending it? Then we also bring in things like external events. So it can be like public holidays, the weather, foot traffic, et cetera, interest rates, all things that's happening out in the economy that is affecting sales, and to be able to actually quantify that and to understand what is the real impact that marketing is having. And so I know we've all heard about MMMs before. I think traditionally what I've seen it used as in my past is it's been a little bit more, I use it for planning because we do it once a year, we do it every 6 months, and it's hard to use in real time because it's all old data. Luckily, there are solutions like Growth OS that are popping up that can actually be super fast, updating on a monthly basis instead of this 6 months or annual time frame. It can be cost effective, and it actually is super easy as a platform to arm marketers with that tool rather than it just being like a 50-page PowerPoint. So ultimately, what this does is help make marketing more tangible for people in the C-suite. So Will, on to you about, what is that language that we really want to talk about there?
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, look, absolutely. This is all about understanding that for that C-suite, marketing is just one component of everything else that they're trying to control and improve efficiencies in to make sure that the business is ultimately growing. And that's why econometrics are such a common tool amongst the C-suite. And one of the most fundamental reasons that these kind of solutions help is because that they're looking at the contribution rather than the attribution of media. I'm sure many people are familiar with this kind of the difference in this terminology, but it's such a crucial one to be always keeping top of mind, especially when you're comparing results from a marketing mix model back to any kind of attribution or digital attribution solution. So just to kind of go over this again for those who haven't seen this before, within attribution and within MTA, etc., most of the time, any sales outcome is trying to be attributed back to a digital touch point that was observed in the past. So where possible, every sale is going to be attributed back to where there might have been some kind of exposure or some kind of impression. And so if you had two competing strategies or two channels, whichever channel or strategy had the most sales associated with them, that would be deemed the winner. And that's what people would be optimizing to. However, in contribution, the difference is that we expect, because we know that there's a lot of sales happening that aren't because of marketing. And yes, some people might have been exposed to your media, but they were going to buy anyway. And so this is where it's all about looking at the incremental sales that were driven by media, understanding what the baseline was, and then what additional sales were driven on top of that. And so if you had the same strategies as we looked at within attribution, but then looked at them from a contribution point of view, you'd say base one potentially was associated with the most sales, but strategy two delivered the most incremental sales. So actually there was a lower base and the impact of media was greater. And so if you're going to be optimizing, actually strategy two or channel two or whatever it is going to be delivering a greater return for what you spent. So that's a bit of the fundamentals of it. And that means that we should be expecting that there's more to sales than just the effect of marketing. Four general buckets that we look at within Growth OS is understanding what the size of that base sales actually is. Now, if you removed all your marketing, you would probably expect that that base is going to slowly diminish over time as people lose their awareness of your products. But it's such an important thing to know, especially when you're trying to set targets for the future. If you know what your baseline sales levels are at, then you know how many additional sales you need to drive from your marketing to be hitting your targets. So it's such a crucial bit of information. Then we want to understand the dynamics that pricing has. We know pricing is such a powerful lever to be pulling. So as you're pushing any discounts into the market or potentially any offers, how is that having an effect on the sales outcome? Again, beyond any marketing activity that you're doing. And then we have to be conscious that there's so many different external events. We're going to see fluctuations with seasonality, potentially spikes for certain holiday events. For certain industries, there might be other events that are critically important to understand what impact that they're having. And that can be really hard when often marketing might be run in concert with these different external events. And that's why it's so important to be trying to disentangle and understand the impact of marketing and the actual impact of these external events and what you'd expect to see if there was no marketing being run at the same time. And so finally you have the impact that your marketing is driving. And you're able to then to say, for every dollar that I'm putting into my marketing activity, how many dollars am I ultimately getting back? So as Tracy mentioned, there's so many different tools that you can be using in media measurement. And a lot of time you need to use the right solution to get to the data point that you need. Now, here we've just classified or distributed some of those measurement solutions across those two metrics that we've talked about. So what is the business value being generated or being identified from that measurement solution? That's on our x-axis there. So, impression volume might be useful for knowing how your campaign is delivering. But as Tracy said, you don't know actually how many dollars that's delivered back. Then on the y-axis, we're talking about how incremental is that measurement. So, if we're just doing some kind of measurement that's just counting outcomes, we don't know if those outcomes are incremental or not. So the top right is ultimately where we want to be. Because if you're measuring the incremental impact or business value, that's where you're unlocking marketing return of investment. And the two main solutions there are either sales lift tests. So that's where you're having a holdout or a control cell, and you're measuring the difference between those who have been exposed to those who have been not exposed. Or you're using market mix models, which are inferring the incremental sales of your marketing. Now, both have their advantages and disadvantages. With sales lift tests, incredibly powerful and generally referred to as the gold standard in measuring incrementality. The challenge with them can be just how can you run them at scale? They generally have to be run in a fairly strict scientific manner, being very specific in terms of what they're looking to measure, and have sufficient power to make sure you get a statistically significant result. Market mix models, you do still have the requirements to achieve those levels of statistical robustness, but the ability to look over the last number of years across all your channels means that you're able to have a look at so many different outcomes of different channels, different levels of spend, and the effect of different time periods, etc. So marketing mix models kind of provide you this, treasure chest of different insights that you can be pulling out. That's hopefully makes sense in terms of theory. In terms of practically, how does it work out? We've got a lovely case study here that we ran from activity we ran with a global CPG advertiser. Ultimately, their goal was that they were looking to adopt MROI so that they could have better conversations with the C-suite and improve the argument for the marketing budget they needed. Traditionally, they had been planning their media based off reach and engagement. And their goal, alongside with us, was to move towards this measurement based on the efficiency of their media, especially ensuring they could remain efficient as their budgets were increasing. What they had to do was face the challenge of how they could change their media channel mix. We mentioned this very early on. Channels are constantly changing. We see emerging channels. We're seeing channels under pressure, perhaps performing not as well now as they were last year or 5 years ago. So they knew they had to evolve and adopt these new channels. The problem was they didn't have additional budget for these channels. They had to try and understand how they could redistribute their existing media channel spend across the new channels. So the solution through Growth OS was using the predictive functionality that we have. So with that predictive functionality, we can be having a look at how the performance of channels would change across different levels of channel spend. And what that allowed them to do was then say, where can we draw savings through removing potential wasted spend on some channels where channels are no longer as efficient as they could be? Removing that spend and redistributing it to another channel that we believe has a headroom to be efficient at higher levels of spend. Now, ultimately, the analysis showed that they could be cutting $800,000 worth of spend from some of their poor performing channels and start to reallocate that to the emerging high efficiency channels. And the results were really impressive. So actually they managed to increase their ROI by 100% year on year. And that allowed them to have the conversations with their C-suite. They were able to say, this is the return of the investment that we're making in marketing. For every dollar we're putting in, we're now getting more dollars out. And using the predictive tools, we can then say, if we had more investment, this is what we'd expect to then see above and beyond that. And the C-suite can then make very quantified decisions as to whether that is the right investment for the business or not. Just one last call out on those results. By optimizing to efficiency rather than reach, they were still optimizing to the right audience. So for this CPG advertiser, they were still seeing a lift in their key demographics by optimizing based off revenue rather than optimizing against reach and engagement. So hopefully for many of you, that's starting to sound like a great opportunity. I suspect if there's any brand managers on the call, you might be still having a few concerns because how do you actually put a dollar value in building an emotional connection between a consumer and your brand? Brand managers I've worked with in the past often have the hardest time trying to quantify that value of building brand equity. But at Mutinex, we definitely believe that you can and you should, because ultimately all marketing is designed to drive sales just over different time periods. So with brand marketing, we've got to be considering the long-term impact of that activity, not just the short-term impact. And Tracy, I'd love to pass back to you just to take us through how we go about that.
Yeah, I think this is one that's just like we all know as marketers that brand is so important. We need to invest, a healthy amount of our total budget in brand, but it's so hard to be like, oh, how do I put a dollar value on that? So there are ways to do that. Let's maybe first talk about, just the different types of impact that brand has. And I think ultimately there are many ways that it can be measurable, and it doesn't have to be this intangible thing, right? So I think Will was alluding to it, but we all probably know the concept of like the long and the short of it, right? So let's talk about the short of it first. We all know that, even if you're running upper funnel media on right now, that's going to lead to some amount of sales. And so usually the hardest part of measuring those types of channels is, out of home. I don't know how many people passed a billboard. How do we measure you seeing a billboard to actual sales? But with an MMM and like Growth OS, you can easily just see all the channels within the same methodology, whether they're digital or more traditional channels, and have a dollar pointed to each one to say, okay, my ROI for TV is X and my ROI for social is Y, and which one's better and what is each channel actually delivering for me, right? So that's already an easy comparison. The second part of the short term, which I've worked with a banking customer on just recently, is this concept of like synergies. So we all know marketing works in a funnel, and there should be a very stark difference between if you just have social and search on versus if you have just social and search on with the same budget, and then you also overlay upper funnel media like TV, out of home radio, etc. So I was able to do an analysis for a bank on this a couple of weeks ago where we looked at 2 time periods, and pretty much it was exactly what I'm talking about. One was just performance because their CMO was like, oh, I only want to be able to do things that I can measure on and make optimizations. And then finally convinced them to be like, all right, we need to try brand spend. So they had both on at the same time. And when you compare the efficiencies of the performance media by itself, you saw it go from like negative 20% to positive 200%. And that's insane, right? The fact that just that same media is working a ton harder because you have that upper funnel media at the same time. So that's kind of the short of it. Will has a lovely case study here on the actual long of it to what we were talking about. So this is the really unquantifiable part when we have brand equity metrics, awareness consideration, unaided awareness. And we all know there's that, again, that relationship that I talk about of sales increasing when those metrics increase. But how do you actually put a dollar to it other than saying, yeah, they're related? So I worked on another customer. It's a global CPG company as well. And we were working on a challenger brand. So we ingested data for them over like 3 years. And you can do this basically with any MMM. And they had in 2019 decided that they wanted to take a big bet on one of their smaller brands and just invest a ton of money in there, specifically brand media, and see how it, comes out. So in 2022, sales have been increasing significantly. Some of that is because of marketing, some of that is maybe because of pricing and many of the other things that Will had talked about. But a lot of it actually, we hypothesize that it's because of the brand equity metrics. So by ingesting monthly brand equity metrics and understanding what is that natural base sales, so that natural run rate of sales over that same time frame, we have a model that's called our brand equity model, essentially within Growth OS, that is able to show what is the actual dollars, which is the exact thing that we're looking for as marketers to be able to talk to our CFO in saying, okay, over 3 years, all of that investment that I put in, it led to a 12% lift in consideration, 12 points. And then for awareness and spontaneous awareness, it led to 10 points up. And what that means in dollars is that my base sales actually increased almost double. So it went up another $5.5 million of sales extra per month by having your brand metrics at a higher level. Conceptually, that makes sense to all of us, right? If you will go for 3 years building your awareness for a beer brand, and that's the number one beer brand that comes up in your head when you're like, I would like a cold one today, then your sales are going to skyrocket because of that. And that's not, that's not even including the marketing that you have on at that moment in time 3 years later. So it's really in addition to that. So it's super important, I think, highlighting and that we know brand is really important, and being able to say how important though, what is the value of it? And so you can easily quantify what is the short-term value, what is the synergies that it has on the performance media when we think about the marketing funnel, and what is that long-term effect that my media 3 years ago is ultimately doing and building the business. So I think we spent a lot of time now talking about, what's the right metric? How do we report on the right thing? How do we quantify the impact of brand, which are all super, super important as first steps. The next step is probably just thinking about how do we continue to make ourselves better, right? Like as marketers, we're always like, we need to get more efficient. We need to keep working. Even if we get more budget, we're still thinking in the campaign, how do we make it better? So Will, curious to get your thoughts based on your background and everything, like how do we continue to back that up?
Yeah, for me, this is kind of moving from talking the talk to walking the walk. So hopefully, if you've got the right metrics for the right tools in place and you're having those great conversations with the C-suite, and hopefully they're then giving you more budget to be working with, you got to deliver. You got to come back and say, it worked, or at least you got learnings, and then pushing for how do you get that next increase in budget so you can maintain that growth trajectory. Now, for me, in my experience, the best way to be working on this is by having this physical process, because it's not something that you should just be doing on an ad hoc basis of jumping in and saying, right, let's run a prediction here, prediction there, let's look at different scenarios and going off the back of that. That can be great, but it's not always built for the long term. To drive long-term growth and constantly evolving with that changing media landscape, you need to just ultimately be following these 4 steps. I call it the growth flywheel, because if you start kind of following each steps in series, you can start to build momentum and you start to increase the rate of your growth. Just to touch through these, so you would start with the hypothesis. So you need to be starting with the data. Most customers, all advertisers say that they're data-driven, data-oriented, but you need to be quite clear and concise about what you're actually drawing from that data. It's not about trying to pull every metric under the sun. It's understanding what the highest priority opportunity is to you. So from your data saying, I believe there's an opportunity that if we increase spend in this channel, we will get a better either increase revenue or increase ROI. But then you need to validate that, because insights are going to be driven out of data that might be amongst a whole load of historic activity, and you want to make sure that that hypothesis is going to stand up and prove to be true when you actually activate against it. So you want to validate it. You want to execute a media plan that's applying that recommendation, and you know what you're looking for when you look at the results from that. And this is kind of why at Growth within Mutinex and using Growth OS, we think it's just so important to be having these monthly refreshes, because you can start doing your hypotheses and validating them at a much higher frequency than you can be doing if you were using marketing mix models on a 6-month or an annual basis, because it's so hard to be actioning and validating against. A step many people miss is that they love to jump onto the next opportunity, where actually you need to be banking your learnings. You need to be adopting those insights that you've proven to be true, so that you start to see that step change, that bump in your performance. And so you have this new BAU approach to how you work. So you may have worked in one way last year. Now you've got the proof that you need to adopt a new way and have a new BAU with a better outcome. Now, before you jump straight back into building new hypotheses, I think it's always good to remember that for most marketers, there's too many channels and too many permutations of ways of executing channels for you to have all the insight that you need to make the best next decision. So I always push customers, push the advertisers we work with, to be exploring those opportunities at the right level of spend, that we can start to see whether there is new opportunity, maybe through scaling spend in a new channel that they haven't used before, or trying new tactics that they just haven't used before. But that's going to give us the data points to then create new hypotheses. If you don't do any exploratory work, you're just always going to be working within your own almost within your own bubble, knowing only what you've done in the past, rather than looking for those new opportunities to be moving into. So you explore, you create new insights, you build new hypotheses, and you validate again. Now, this doesn't have to be about making earth-shatteringly large leaps into new executional approaches. For me, it's about making these consistent step changes. It's like the idea of cumulative gains being, the seventh wonder of the world, ultimately, just making sure that ultimately you are making decisions. It's great having data, it's great having insights, but if you're not acting on them, you're not going to get any value off the back of it. So even if you think that these opportunities might be quite small, maybe it's about slightly changing your creative, maybe it's about slightly altering the formats that you're using, you should see these improvements be building up over time. And over time, going back and saying to the C-suite, we've done X, Y, and Z. And that has moved the revenue or ROI up in terms of what we're delivering back. So making sure that you have this as a process. And this is why I think it's so important that the activation of measurement isn't ad hoc, but it's continuous. That's where you're going to get the greatest overall return. So following those steps of over time, having this period of hypothesis building, having this period of validating by putting into market, making sure you adopt or deprove the insights that you had, and then exploring new insights and repeating that again. For me, those are the opportunities. So, Tracy, take us away with some of the key takeaways we talked to.
Yeah, we'll summarize our 4 easy steps. So I think it's a lot of talk, so it's good to summarize this stuff. I think first it's about finding the right metric, that North Star, right? And that kind of bleeds into the second step of speaking the same language as the entire business, rather than just, speaking language of marketing and bringing that out to the world, right? So talking about business revenue, business value, sales and leads, et cetera, bringing that into your reporting. But ultimately what that relies on is having the right tool to be able to speak that language, right? So an MMM like GrowthOS is able to do that and quantify those things in dollar values, which becomes a much easier conversation with your CFO and CEO. The third step is starting to quantify that brand. It's this very mysterious, elusive, dark funnel that we kind of talk about here, where brand does so many things and the value of it is so hidden. So once we're able to actually put a dollar amount to that and speak to the business about the importance, it's no longer this, why do you spend 50% of your budget on brand? It's like, oh, should we be spending more on brand? How much more money can you take to do more brand things? Because it's going to lead to this much more revenue for the business. And lastly, to Will's topic, and I think my favorite topic as well, is just this implementation cycle, right? Of, we use these tools to get an understanding, and we have to hypothesize and start to build that up and reap the benefits over a long period of time. So having the tools that becomes more repeatable with the right metric in there. So that monthly kind of cadence that we do at GrowthOS makes it super powerful to do that. Put all those things together, and this conversation of defending and growing budgets becomes much, much easier. So that about summarizes it for today. I just wanted to thank everyone for their time. Hopefully there are some insights and takeaways here. We will move on to Q&A. So I'm going to leave Will to kind of handle that for today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you very much, Will. We can go ahead and get started with our Q&A if we're ready to go. How are you doing, Will, after that wonderful presentation?
Yeah, good, thanks. Really enjoyed it. And again, really good to be here.
Yeah, me as well. I feel like I learned a lot, and I'm excited to learn more by getting some answers to these pressing questions. So first off, we have someone asking, how do you recommend convincing higher ups to invest in growth platforms and operating systems when we are in a budget shaving period? I feel like you touched on this certainly throughout the presentation, but if you could distill it at all, I'm sure this question asker would be grateful.
Sure. There's probably some quite simple arguments to be putting forward. As we said before, make sure you're speaking their language, be talking about revenue, how you're impacting the bottom line. What's going to happen if you saw a 5% improvement in that return from your marketing budget? What does that mean in terms of the impact it's going to have on your business? For us, we generally say, you should be looking for a 5 to 10% improvement in your ROI at least. Now, that should be returning you an improvement, a return of investment from your growth platform you're investing in. And actually then you're improving your revenue to the point that it's paying back for that growth investment. So just start looking at the numbers and say, for your media budget, what improvement in ROI would you need to drive in order to then pay back for your investment in the growth platform? And if that looks achievable, if you're starting to have to achieve, let's say, 70 to 80% improvement in ROI, that could be tougher. We still see it's achieved by a lot of advertisers, but it might be harder to do from the growth platform. So have a look at what you need to get a positive return of investment.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, moving right along to our next question. Kim Jones asks, how do you separate brand value from basically just having a good product in word of mouth referrals?
Yeah, so brand value, we're actually looking at the relationship to brand tracking metrics. So to unlock that, you need to be using brand tracking and have that over the last few years. So the model is ultimately bringing that in the same way that it's bringing in information about your price points, your paid media, etc. And it's looking at how brand tracking metrics like consideration, awareness, explaining sales over time. And that helps us then quantify the value of each additional improvement in point per consideration, etc. So yeah, it's very much data-led, and it's very much done in a similar way to how the rest of the model operates.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right, this one spans a little bit outside of our presentation here today, but we'll go ahead and take a stab at it regardless. So this question asker inquires, our content creation team is being gradually turned into an AI team. Do you have any insight on how to prove human value to our CMO in the AI age?
Interesting. Yeah, look, I mean, there's so much research that says creative is the most important aspect of any campaign. It doesn't matter how many people you reach or how often, if your creative doesn't cut through, your campaign's not going to be successful. So it's so critical to get right. Now, generally, when it comes to creative, a lot of platforms offer A/B testing capabilities. So being able to put different creatives into market and saying which one drove the better response. Now this is where multi-touch attribution or just attribution reports can still work quite well when it's just on a single publisher and looking at the performance difference between two campaigns, because we should have the same audience, we expect the same base level of sales. So we're just looking at which campaign performed the best. That said, over a longer period of time, you can still be using marketing mix models. The likes of Growth OS, we make sure that you can be inputting a creative tag and name, etc. So you can be comparing different creatives against each other over time and making sure that we're seeing consistently that one creative is outperforming the other. So yeah, absolutely, you want to be testing it, whether that's just within a specific publisher with an A/B test or over time with a growth platform.
Definitely. So spending plenty of time still testing all of the creatives, regardless of how we're getting there. Awesome. All right, moving right along. This next question asks, is there an average percent of sales forecast / goals that a marketing budget should be for higher success? For example, our marketing budget is only 6% of 2024 sales goals, but I've heard larger companies have 15%.
Look, I think this is a complex question. Every business needs to decide how to allocate budget to different parts of the business. Now, in many businesses, they kind of set up in a way which is they have a part devoted to acquisition, a part devoted to operations, a part devoted to price is often quite separate as well. And then retention can sit opposite within that also. So every business needs to have a look at those different areas and look at what is the most important area of investment for them. Now, that's not an easy decision for any company to be making. I guess every area of the business just has to be putting forward their argument as to why they need to be receiving a certain amount of money. Ultimately, budget should come down to what the acquisition budget should come down to what that business needs to grow by over the next year and how much budget is required to achieve that. And that's why having a good idea of ROI is so useful in order to make that case. So yeah, it's not a straightforward question. I don't think there's one number that's going to suit every advertiser, but at least if every part of the business can put forward their case and have a good sense of what budget they need and what return they're going to get from that, that makes the conversation, as we said, far more easy to have because you're all talking the same language.
Definitely. Well, as we know from that last question, not every marketing budget and platform is one size fits all. And this next question focuses on something similar, asking, should we focus on growing many small markets, each with a small niche budget and plan, or do we put all of our eggs into one or two large baskets?
Look, there is efficiencies in size. So if you're a small player, you're always having to work harder. So when you've got a low market share, you're always having to work hard. Your marketing has to work harder than if you're a big player in that market. If you're already building up that mental availability within your audience, then it's actually easier to maintain that with your advertising. Whereas if you've got a small share of market and a lower level of awareness, then you're constantly having to work really hard to try and make people consider you. People are naturally going to get drawn to the largest players in any industry. It's one of the rules within the books of how brands grow, etc. So there is definitely an argument to say, if you start to work harder in just one market and put more emphasis on that and try and grow your share, then you can have more efficiencies in the future. And actually, you should find it, you can be driving revenue easier from that market. If you're trying to spread your budget across lots of other markets and you can't maintain or build a significant share of market, then you're always going to have to be working hard, and the bigger players are always going to have an advantage over you.
Definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, moving on to our next question. This person starts with a bit of an exclamation saying, brand equity is difficult to measure. Could you please provide another example of how to do this successfully?
Another example of how to do it successfully. So I think this is where, in terms of trying to demonstrate the value of it in a monetary form, it can be extremely hard to do, because brand campaigns are, on one hand, just trying to drive that emotive connection between the advertiser and the consumer. But for the advertiser, the end goal should be that drives sales, just probably over a much longer period of time. Because yes, that's the whole reason behind any kind of advertising, ultimately, just what time period you want the outcome to come across. I'm not really across any other solutions that are able to look at the value brand equity in terms of the ROI it generates, because of that long-term effect. The only other way I could really imagine is if you were to do some long period test and control type analysis, multi-cell, so looking at two different geographies or randomized cohorts, and having a look at where you're building brand over time, how that cohort is performing versus a cohort where you're not doing brand building over time. But with that, there are a whole bunch of statistical considerations to take into account. So I don't know for sure if that would actually work too well. And this is why trying to take the modeled approach, and as we'd see, the future of measurement is really modeled. You really have to have those signals and be able to track things over time and say, as your brand is increasing or decreasing across different brand equity metrics, how can we be tracking the relation that has to the revenue you're generating?
Absolutely. All right, moving along. Our next question asks, our channel reach has been outdated for a while, like Facebook outdated. How do you have a recommendation for how to prove value and increase budget for platforms we do not have much reporting or history on, like TikTok?
I guess to my understanding of the question, so can you repeat the question? I just feel like
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was kind of a long one. All right, this person asks, our channel reach has been outdated for a while, like Facebook outdated. Do you have a recommendation for how to prove value and increase budget for platforms we do not have much reporting or history on, such as TikTok?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, even on TikTok, you should know how much you're spending on a weekly basis, and you should be able to get a sense of how many impressions are being delivered on a weekly basis. So you should still be able to use marketing mix models for those channels. And Facebook, now Meta, has got a marketing mix model API and UI, so you can go in and pull the data required if you wanted to take that route. Meta is ahead of the curve in trying to work alongside Apple's transparency tracking solution with the likes of CAPI, so conversions API, so you can be having this feedback loop to understand actually what actions are being taken from your campaigns. But ultimately, these platforms should still work in the world of marketing mix models, because you can be taking the right information from those platforms and using them in models going forwards.
Absolutely. All right. This next question asks, what are the trade-offs between having a marketing agency you work with compile an MMM for you versus getting a third party like Mutinex to do it?
I think often a lot of agencies we work with like to be seen working with an independent measurement agency, because it shows they're not marking their own homework. Ultimately, it's similar to the concerns people have around a lot of their media measurement coming from the media platforms that they use. So advertising on Google and reporting coming from Google, advertising on Facebook and using Ads Manager to measure the performance of Facebook. So a lot of agencies are now saying, you know what, don't take our word for it. Take the word of this independent measurement vendor. They're going to tell you exactly what's happening, and that's not going to be us trying to look at how we can build any kind of models in our favor, ultimately. I guess this comes back also to the advantage of having a generalized model where you're not trying to build anything bespoke to the activities that you're running, which could result in any kind of bias to say this has been successful. A generalized model is going to say, we're not going to be treating this customer any different to another customer and their media any different. And so we expect a very fair comparison as to whether their measurement is whether their advertising is working or not. So yeah, I'd say ultimately it's just about being able to say, this isn't us marking our own homework, and this is, an independent measurement.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, it looks like we might have time for one or two more questions here. So hopefully we can get to two, but we'll give it our best shot. This person asks, we went through pretty major layoffs last quarter and are feeling pretty overwhelmed. Does Mutinex help reduce workload, or is there substantial onboarding for the Growth OS platform?
There's two sides to this. So onboarding, we do often see that advertisers have to find a new way of working to start orientating themselves around their own data, knowing exactly where it is. But then we have, as I mentioned, our Data OS platform, which is a data management platform, where we're trying to make that process as straightforward as possible. So yes, over the first few weeks, there can be workload to try and start building processes around supplying data. Long term, it should be reducing workload. So if you basically were to think about all the decisions that an advertiser needs to make over the course of a year, let's say they're using 10 channels, they're probably using more. They're thinking about different creatives that they have to use per channel and what formats they should be using, how much spend, what type of flighting. There's so many decisions that every advertiser needs to make. And a lot of the time, they're having to go through so many different sources of information to make those decisions. So that becomes a very high workload environment, and a lot of context switching between what am I seeing from Google Analytics, what am I seeing from my other platform reports, etc. So that's why it can be so much work. This is why we see having Growth OS as making life easier for people ultimately, because it requires just going into this single source of truth, and you have all your channels within it, you have all your performance metrics per channel, and you're able to deep dive into creatives formats within this single portal ultimately. Now, this isn't to say it will be the only measurement tool in your armory. However, it does provide that kind of all-in-one, all channels under one roof, and making life much easier to go in and contrast and compare and understand the performance difference across your activity, and hopefully result in having to make fewer, better decisions rather than lots of decisions across your individual publishers.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like that was such a well thought out and robust answer to that question. So thank you again. All right, we'll try to sneak in just one more because we still have a few waiting in the queue. Our last question for today, Marcus asks, for B2B product with long adoption/sales cycles, what are the best practices to understand/establish connection and ROI with your marketing programs?
Yeah, good question. So often when you do have long lead cycles, it can create challenges for models to try and understand that relationship between when the advertising was active and when you're actually picking up the final signal of sales. When we work with B2B advertisers who do have very long sales cycles, then we do look for upper funnel metrics to be working from, like leads potentially. This is where you probably want to have a look at your different signals that you're getting of how likely a sale is going to occur. So if you are kind of B2B business and you receive leads from prospective businesses, and you've got a good sense of what the conversion rate is of those leads, and then what the potential future value is of those customers, then you can be building out that as how to use leads as your target metric within your model, because that's one of the first signals that you get of potential purchase uptake. And then you apply this CLV, which has this conversion rate baked into it. So you've got a decent signal up front, which hasn't got too long a lag. And then you apply your conversion and lifetime value for that customer to take you to a revenue outcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for going into further detail to explain that. And thank you again, Will, for sticking along with us to answer so many good questions. I wanted to thank you and Tracy for being here with us today, and to Mutinex for sponsoring this webinar. Just as a reminder to all attendees, this session is available on demand, and you'll be receiving a link to the on-demand content with 24 hours from the end of this webinar. Before you go, I'd like to draw your attention to the session survey, which is now available on the right-hand side of your screen. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you again to our Mutinex team.
Thank you.